This is something that happened a few years ago and still haunts my dreams every night. We all stood around on the boat that had been provided to us. It was a freezing cold morning and a mist hung heavy across the lake. There were 10 of us taking part in this expedition. It was led by a professor named Alan Connors who had convinced some people with deep pockets to fund this. The rest of the team were made up of grad students and also 2 drivers, whose job it was to control the 2 submersibles that had been provided. The other grad students were very giddy as they suspected that they had been specifically chosen by the professor. I knew that he had probably chosen us because he wouldn't have to pay us for anything. The professor clapped his hands and we began to climb into the submersible that we were designated to. I was relieved that I wasn't claustrophobic as it was beyond cramped in here. One of the other students, Adam, joked that he had hoped that no one had beans last night, as a fart would probably suffocate us. It was met with half-hearted groans as he smiled away to himself. The professor gave him an annoyed look which wiped the smile off of Adam's face. I watched through the window as we were carefully lowered into the water. I felt a shiver run up my spine as we were finally fully submerged. Our pilot Billy started moving us forward, and was using the sonar to see if he could find anything else down here. The lights from the sub lit up the lake and it gave the water an ominous look. We saw very little in the first hour or 2, apart from a couple of startled fish who swam away almost as soon as they had appeared. The other sub came in over the intercom and announced that they had found an underwater cave. The professor instructed Billy to head over to the other sub so we could go and check it out. We moved both of these subs into the cave and stayed down for almost a minute. We followed the course of the cave for almost 10 minutes until we finally surfaced inside a gigantic underground cave. It was lit by some weird natural lighting that made it look both beautiful and terrifying as well. Billy confirmed that the air outside was breathable and we all climbed out to explore. Billy and the other pilots stood around the subs to make sure that nothing happened to them. The professor began issuing orders and we rushed around following his instructions. We were paired in teams of 2 and I was stuck with Adam. We moved to the far end of the cavern and I had to listen to an endless stream of bad jokes from Adam. I hoped that my silence would make him shut up, but he didn't take the hint. We were walking along the edge of the water on our way back to the others when I noticed something gigantic moving underneath the surface. I tried to point it out to Adam, but it had disappeared before he could see it. We reached the others and none of them had discovered anything of interest. One of the girls, Jenny, had found a small cave system but had only gone in a small distance. The professor looked crestfallen, as he had obviously expected to find something to placate his investors. Adam opened his mouth to tell another joke, when he was cut off by an ear-splitting scream. We rushed in the direction of these screams to find Billy and being dragged along the ground towards the water. Something that looked like a tentacle but was as black as the night sky was wrapped around his legs. Billy's face was contorted into a look of pure agony. I grabbed onto his arm and Adam grabbed the other and we attempted to pull him free. Another student, who I think was called George, rushed forward and began stomping on the tentacle. Another tentacle came out of nowhere and smashed into George and sent him flying across the cavern. I heard a sickening thud as his body collided with the far wall. We managed to pull Billy free in this time, and began to move as far away from the water as possible. And Billy kept screaming at the top of his lungs, as his legs had been crushed. We watched as dozens of tentacles appeared out of the water and dragged these submersibles beneath the surface. The other pilot was nowhere to be found and I assumed that he had already been dragged to his death. We gathered at the far corner of the cavern and tried to plan how we could escape. My eyes kept being drawn to George's body, which lay broken on the floor only a few feet away. We argued for hours with no one able to come up with an idea that we could all agree to. We decided for the present time to get some sleep for the moment. We were all exhausted and it seemed like the best idea at the time. Billy's screams were keeping me awake, but they were silenced after an hour. I awoke the next morning and looked over to see that someone had cut Billy's neck overnight. No one had admitted to doing it, but we all pretended like nothing had happened. It was decided that we would try the cave system that Jenny had found. We made our way over and it looked extremely tight, but we should all be able to fit through it. We started moving one by one through the caves with myself in the lead, and Adam following close behind. We used our torches to help us navigate our way through. There were small holes on the edges of the cave, and I kept seeing something darting in and out of them. I never got a chance to get a close look at them, as they vanished before I got a close look. I reached the edge of the cave and stepped into a cavern that dwarfed the other cavern. It was at least 10 times bigger, and I could barely see the edge in the distance. It was lit by the same strange light that had illuminated the other cavern. The others slowly came out of the caves and joined me in the cavern. We were standing around waiting for Jenny, as she was in the very rear. After a few minutes, we began to get worried and I went back in to find her. I carefully made my way back as I kept getting a weird feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in all directions, as my mind was telling me that I was going to get attacked. I tripped over something and fell face first on the ground. My torch fell out of my hand and went out. My heart started pounding as I was now in complete darkness and I kept hearing skittering noises all around me. I began moving my hands along the ground in a desperate attempt to find the torch. My hand brushed against something with thick fur that darted away. I let out a screech and backed away, and once again I tripped. I landed hard on the ground, but luckily, my hand came to rest on top of the torch. I quickly switched it on and shone it around me, and I was greeted by the sight of Jenny's body, which looked like it had bites taken out of it. I shone the light around once again, and froze as I saw dozens of what looked like spiders advancing towards me. They were the size of cats and had thick black fur with red eyes that were locked onto mine. I jumped up and began running forward and hoping that I was heading towards the others. I burst out into the cavern, and I was greeted by a sea of worried faces. It took me a minute or two to get my breath back, and I then explained what I had found. The professor squeezed my shoulder to offer me some comfort. He then told me to follow him, and we began to make our way further into the cavern. It became clear that we were on a higher part of the cavern, and we reached an edge that gave us a view of what was below. I let out a gasp as I gazed down at the floor, which was littered with thousands of bones. Even from this distance, they seemed enormous, as if it was an elephant's graveyard. Many of the bones still had flesh on them, so they had all died recently. We went back to the others and we agreed to move down into the lower part of the cavern and see if there was anything on the far side. We all walked by in silence as we passed the bones. They were awe-inspiring closer up, as you could walk between them with your arms outstretched and not touch the opposite side. Whatever animal these belonged to was larger than anything any of us had ever seen. We froze when we heard a noise in the distance and rushed to cover. We then watched as a creature that looked like a dinosaur appeared out of the water that was pooling at the edge of the cavern. It began moving towards us in a lethargic way. It had a long neck that reminded me of a giraffe, and a big, bloated belly. I recognized it immediately, as it looked just like the pictures of the Loch Ness monster that had been circulating for years on end. It stopped a short distance from us and then rolled over, dead. The professor began moving forward, and I yelled at him to stop. He either didn't hear me or ignored me as he kept going. He placed his hands on Nessie's stomach and then let out a yell of triumph. He then turned to us and told us to take some pictures so that he could show everyone what we had found. Before any one of us could reach for some cameras, there was a ripping sound and Nessie's stomach suddenly exploded. Thousands of those spiders flooded out and quickly engulfed the professor. His screams were quickly silenced as they feasted on him. The 3 of the other students were consumed by these spiders before they even had time to react. The rest of us began running off in the opposite direction. I could hear the skittering noises of these spiders grow faint as we quickly outran them. We reached another cave system and rushed inside. It was now just myself, Adam, and another student called Lily. We used our torches and moved forward for almost an hour. We decided to try and get some sleep as we hadn't seen anything else living in quite some time. I had a dream of spiders feasting on my eyeballs and I awoke in a cold sweat. We ate our meager supplies the next morning and then we set off again. We reached a room that was lit by sunlight that was streaming from high above. The walls had a number of cracks that could be used as handholds. We started carefully climbing with me once again leading the way. We were halfway up when I heard a scraping noise from below, and I looked down to see that Lily was losing her grip, and then she slowly slipped away and fell. We quickly locked eyes, but she silently plummeted to the ground. She didn't make a sound, and I almost vomited after watching her skull being shattered by a stone on the floor below. Her dead eyes were still locked into mine, and it felt like they were blaming me for her death. Adam tapped me on the bottom of my foot, which awoke me from my trance, and I started climbing once again. We were nearing the top when Adam told me to shush and be quiet, as he could hear something coming. We paused, and then both looked around, but we didn't see anything. All of a sudden, one of the spiders jumped out of one of the holes that we had been using as handholds to climb, and it landed directly on Adam's face. Without thinking, he tried to use both of his hands to rip it off. For some reason, time seemed to slow down as I watched the realization on his face as he realized that he was falling to his death. I couldn't look, so I turned away at the last moment, but I still heard the sickening thud as his body made contact with the ground below. After some time, I finished my climb, and I found myself somewhere in the woods. I slowly crawled my way back and soon got to the nearest village, and I tried to explain what had happened to my group to all the locals there. For some reason, they weren't surprised. They didn't seem shocked at all by my story, and they let me call my parents, and they even offered me some food and drink and a place to rest. Since then, I've tried to explain this to people, but no one has ever believed me. And all of the people who went with me on that expedition are still listed as missing. I'm the only one that ever made it out of that cave. Many times I've tried to go back and find that cave again, but for some reason, I can never locate it. I don't know if it disappeared or if there's something more sinister going on around here. Regardless, I beg you all to stay away from Loch Ness, as there are far worse things living there than just the Loch Ness Monster.